Testing, testing. Test, test, 1, 2. It's off.
He lived technically in part of Russia And I don't know if you know some of this history. Some of this history, but Jews who had emigrated to Europe from what would have been Israel, from the Arab lands, came to Germany to find a safe place in which to live, because it had been told in the 1200s that if you come to Germany, you'd be able to make a living and to live your life, and that there at that time was more of an open-minded manner in the 1200s, and Jews who came from the Middle East in large numbers came to Germany. How I first knew about this is because of my name Shapiro, and the Jews who came to Germany settled in one of three cities: Worms, Mainz, and Speyer. And my family, presumably, I don't go back in my work to the 1200s, but there were Jews who lived in Speyer, and a couple centuries later, they had all moved to Russia. And Jews who moved to Russia often called themselves Shapiro because they had emanated from Speyer at that time. So that's why there were so many Shapiros who lived in Russia. And I don't know how many of you, your grandparents, your parents or grandparents or great-grandparents, did they emanate from Russia? I mean, a lot of us did so. And the Ukraine was very prominent, and I'll show you a book. My grandma lived in the Ukraine, and I showed this to one group of students. This is a book that I found. My grandmother lived in Sudakov. And my grandma came as a little girl, about 8 years old. She came to the United States. But she was born in Sudakov. And the Baal Shem Tov, I don't know if you know the Baal Shem Tov is really the founder of Hasidism. He had a son whose name was Moshe Chaim Ephraim of Sudakov, and was born in 1748, and he died in 1800. And he was best known as the Baal Shem Tov's grandson. And so happened that I was just looking online, and there was an auction for a book that was an old book that came from Sudakov. I said, well, that's where my grandma had lived. So I really need to try to get that. So I put in a bid online, thinking, what's going to happen if someone else bids, and 3 bids, and it's going to go up. It's going to get pretty expensive. But I was the only bidder. And I'm going to show you this book because it comes from the same area that we're going to talk about with regards to Boinche Schweig, Boinche the Silent. And I want to read this. But you'll see that it's all in Hebrew, but you might find this interesting. You just look at it. It's a beat-up book. It's from 1836, that book. So this was the world in which Isaac Peretz lived. And he was born in Zmansk, Lublin, Poland. Lublin was a larger area that he lived in Zmansk, and there were important Polish communities, and Jews there established yeshivas and hospitals and synagogues and cemeteries and educational opportunities. And there were always Jewish cemeteries that you can still go and look at in European countries to find them, even though they're overgrown dramatically. And they were synagogues and hospitals. You know, when you think about it, we did the exact same thing in the United States. That when Jewish communities assembled, there always was, the first thing they would do was to create a Jewish cemetery, before even there was a synagogue. And then the second item of business was to create a synagogue. And then a third goal was always a hospital. And when you think about it here, even in Milwaukee, it's precisely what happened here too. That we started with cemeteries, and then synagogues, and then Mount Sinai Hospital. And you remember it well, Mount Sinai Hospital? And all the rooms had mezuzahs, and there was a chapel, and we often did baby namings years ago. And I'm here, it's not really that long, 40, 45, 46, 47 years ago I came here. Is that right? 1978? And we were at Mount Sinai Hospital often doing baby namings and brisses and so forth. That's where often the brisses were done, is at Mount Sinai. And it's meaningful because we created this wonderful community of Jewish auxiliaries, and that was true of just about every city. So we know what happens after World War II, and today in that part of Poland where he had lived, there's only 10 to 20,000 Jews. But prior to the war, 3 million Jewish people lived in Poland. 1938, there were 3 million Jews who lived in Poland. And it was a vibrant, dynamic community, more so than Russia was. But it all ended. And he himself was Polish and wanted to do one last thing before we look at the stories. He wanted to create a better understanding of Hebrew, and I think I mentioned that to you, that most of the Jews lived in Russia. And in 1881, the Jews of Russia were still living somewhat comfortably under the Tsar, and Tsar the First. Tsar the Third was just a few years later, began to strike out with anti-Semitism that was so awful that is when people began to go in huge numbers to the United States. In the 1870s, 1880s, under the Tsar, life was not awful. But by 1883, all these resolutions were passed that made life miserable for Jews. And that was the time when people started to leave Russia. And that included people like Peretz, who wanted to create a better life for them somewhere else. So there are 3 stories. If we can make them, I want to do so. And I'll read parts of it. And if you have the copies, it says Boincha the Silent. You should have one copy that says Boincha the Silent. Okay, so I'm going to read, I hope you don't mind, I'll read some of this and skip part of it. Here on earth, the death of Boincha the Silent made no impression at all. Ask anyone, who was Boincha? How did he live and how did he die? Did his strength slowly fade? Did his heart slowly give out? or did the very marrow of his bones melt under the weight of his burdens? Who knows? Perhaps he just died from not eating. Starvation, it's called. If a horse dragging a cart through the streets should fall, people would run from blocks around to stare. Newspapers would write about his fascinating event. A monument would be put up to mark the very spot where the horse had fallen. Had the horse belonged to a race as numerous as that of the human beings, he wouldn't have been paid this honor. How many horses are there, after all? But human beings, there must be thousands, millions of them. Boincha was a human being. He lived unknown, in silence, and in silence he died. He passed through our world like a shadow. When Boincha was born, no one took a drink of wine. There was no sound of glasses clinking. All right, let's stop there for a second. I'll keep where we are. What about this last phrase? There was no sound of glasses clinking. When Boincha was born, no one took a drink of wine. Does that something for the very beginning of his life? This is not only a reference to Boincha, it's a reference to many Jews who disappeared over the centuries without saying a word, without fighting. I don't mean to jump too far, but if you were a woman, a young woman, and you wanted to find a really good mate, a male to marry, who would you look for back in those centuries, in the 17 and 1800s? What kind of man would be the best husband for a wife? What would he be like? A rabbi, a scholar. In other words, a person who wears a long black coat and davens, doesn't fight, davens, studies, prays, moves back and forth, shuckling. Shochenad marom v'kadoy shamoho. That's the Jew you want to marry if you're a woman. And that was true for decades. What happened to Jewish kids, sometimes as young as 12 years old? Picked up off the street, put on a horse, and sent to the Russian army. My grandpa was one such person. My grandpa was a yeshiva bocher. He loved to study and daven. And I spent a lot of times when I was young, I would go and sleep over at my grandparents' house. My grandma had a bedroom on one side of the house. My grandpa had a bedroom on the other side of the house. I always slept in my grandfather's bedroom, on the other bed. There are two beds in there. I never thought a word about it. Never thought, why isn't he sleeping with my grandma? Never. And he was a yeshiva bocher, a typical Russian Jew who didn't want to fight when he was a little kid. And he was like about 5'2". He would sit at the edge of his bed. His feet didn't touch the floor. He sang to me the Hebrew songs. He put his yarmulke on and davened. And then when he was done davening, he would take his yarmulke off, kiss it, and put it under his pillow, and went to bed. And he would say, "Okay, it's time to go to bed." And if he had to get up in the middle of the night for any reason, he would take his yarmulke out, beneath his pillow and put it on his head and go to the bathroom. And then on Saturdays, this is much of my life when I was really young, on Saturdays we would walk to shul together, my grandfather and I. And I have wonderful memories of that. I loved it. Eventually my grandfather passed away, and my grandma came to live in our house. And all the bedrooms were all changed now because we had an extra bedroom. My grandma has to sleep in her own bedroom. Everyone moved out. But we were all close together. The bedrooms are close to each other. And my grandma snored like you can't believe. It sounded like the roof was going to lift up and take off. And then, and only then, did I realize why my grandfather and my grandmother didn't sleep in the same room nor on the same side of the house. He probably couldn't sleep at all because of it. But it was a nice sense of community. Judaism brought about a nice sense of community, and a lot of grandparents came to live with their children, their adult children. It happened to my poor father, too. His mother-in-law was my grandma, and my dad had a fascination and love of getting into the bathtub late at night and taking a real hot bath. And he would fall asleep off in the bathtub, but had this ability to turn the hot water on with his toes in the bathtub. And then he was sound asleep one night. My grandma, who couldn't see very well at this time, has to go to the bathroom. So she comes into the bathroom and she sits down to do her business, and she looks, and there's my dad, her son-in-law, in the bathtub. Oh, and she finished up as fast as she could, and she ran out. And she said to my mom, "Don't tell Print," that was my dad's name, "don't tell Print, but I saw him in the bathtub last night." This is a close family in our community. So let's go back to this thing about no one clicked drink of schnapps or wine. The question is, why not? Why not? And why is it that there is this tradition for Jews and perhaps for all people to give a l'chaim and click a glass? What does it do? What does it represent when you take a drink with another person or with a group of people and you pour a glass of wine? It's a celebration. Yeah. It's a reference to celebrating every single day through each of your senses. Because when you take a glass of wine and you fill the glass with red wine, for example, and you look at it, in that regard you see it. You share that sight with someone you're sharing a drink. You taste it. You feel it. And you celebrate it. It's kind of interesting. When you click glasses, you hear it. So all the senses are used when you celebrate a moment with someone else. And that became, I think, for all peoples, a significant thing to do. And to take in life and to celebrate it. What was sad about Boincha the Silent was that didn't even happen when he was born. And the rest of his life is without manner, without significance. Carol. Yeah, I guess it's
Not just a community, it's a group of 2 to 3 people who are just sort of in on.
and what typically happens, especially for a boy, what happens when a bris occurs? Yeah, in fact, when we go on to this, his parents are awful. Awful. And everything is awful in his life. It turns out to be his parents were awful. The people with whom he worked were awful. The marriage he had was awful. The son he had became awful. And the whole point of this story is that he never said a word, Roger.
But I think our biggest clue comes in the first 3 words. If this is here on earth, there is more love.
Thank you. Right, and there's excitement for him in the world to come. We have to get to this story, this part of the story, to ponder, do we believe in the world to come? And is the world to come, in other words, our soulfulness, which never disappears, because our corporeality eventually fades away. But is there something about our inner essence that makes a difference in the world that somehow will always live on? I do believe in that. You have a faith that there's a place in the world to come, or that there's something spiritual about us that will always abide and exist? Because Judaism believes that. When my mom was passing away, I have 3 other siblings, there's 4 of us, and we made sure that we would all stay with her near the end, the last part of her life. We all would take a week, and then come back and take another week. And Judy and I were there with her when my mom passed away. She died at home. And we talked a lot. We talked a lot and sang to her a lot. And she loved Yiddish music, and we played Yiddish music for her. And one was My Yiddish Mama, that beautiful piece. And my grandmother, who I told you about, was very close to my mom. They shared Friday night dinner. You know, they started Wednesday, and they worked Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday for every single Friday night dinner. And sometimes they argued, you know, in the kitchen, but they were very close. And when my mom was passing away, we played the music, My Yiddish Mama, and I said, you know, and my mom has, at that point, didn't have any reference. She didn't really talk about much at all. So I said, you know, Mom, you had a Yiddish Mama, and she sang to you, and she loved you, and she's going to, I believe, she's going to take you by the hand, and you're going to be okay. And that was the first time she sort of lifted her head up off the pillow and smiled at me. She acknowledged that somehow, some way, there's a connection. And I've been told by many people who have a faith that there's something beyond. I officiated a funeral last year or 2 years ago, and the daughter of the deceased said, you know, my dad always said to me growing up, someday we'll all be together again. And you know, he said that to me enough times, I believe it. And I believe that my dad, that my dad's okay because all of his dear ones, wherever, will take him by the hand somehow. Steve.
Sorry to interrupt, but I have to add a scientific point of view.
Yeah, please.
I have a colleague who's written a book about studies, scientific implications for the afterlife. He's convinced that there's more evidence of an afterlife than evidence of non-afterlife. And his whole book goes through what he thinks are proofs, or at least strong implications that there's an afterlife. And the proof against it is only essentially that we don't know what that is.
Yeah. Except, please.
My brother is 91, and he was writing his memoirs, and he was writing something else, and he became so involved in this research. He absolutely believes that there is a life after.
Is he the rabbi?
Yes.
Your brother, the rabbi?
He's sending me stuff, and he's reading and reading and reading.
Yeah, it's meaningful to be open to it, isn't it? Oh, yeah, that you have a good memory.
I do, yeah. My hearing's bad.
What's that?
My hearing's bad.
But my mom was dying. I'll tell you a good story, too, about my father. But my mom was passing away. She wanted to go to sleep. So it was dark in the room. And she called us in, and she said, "The light. Turn on the light." So I turned on the light on the dresser. She was quiet for a moment. She says, No, turn on the light. So I turned the light on by her bedstand. She was quiet for a moment. She says, No, turn the light on. So I turned the light on the overhead light. And she said, No, turn the light on. And I said, Mom, all the lights in the room are on. And she said, but there's another light. Yeah, so I don't know. But that's, you have good memory. I must have told that story before. So let's go on a little bit here. So there was no celebration for this poor little guy who was born. And now we go to the next paragraph. During his lifetime. See where it says that? His feet left no mark upon the dust of the streets. After the death, the wind blew away the board that marked his grave. But let's go up a little bit. I think this makes more sense. After the glass is clinking. I'm sorry. When he was confirmed, he made no speech of celebration. See where I am? He existed like a grain of sand at the rim of the vast ocean amid millions of other grains of sand, exactly similar. And when the wind at last lifted him up and carried him across to the other shore of that ocean, no one noticed. No one at all. That's the most important thing. That what does that represent in terms of Peretz's thought here? That when he went to the other side, it was the end of his life. But no one ever noticed it because no one ever noticed him as a living creature. One of his purposes, Peretz's purpose, is to try to instill within individuals the ability to speak what you're thinking about, so that you don't disappear as an anonymous nothing to say what you have to say and do what you have to do so that there is a remnant of you that they'll remember. And I think those are the people that move us the most. If we think about those who have passed, but what they did in order to stand their ground, what they did to help others. And I wanted to express that because my dad was somewhat like that with regards to a number of things. One is that in this particular case, Boncha is going to die. And no, he's not buried. And if we go on and read the rest of this, you'll see that not only was he buried, but nobody knew his name. So what they did is they put a stick at where he was buried, and they left. Not even able to say Kaddish, but they said Kaddish, but they left without knowing who it was who they just buried. And when they left, a strong wind came up and blew the stick away. That was the end of him, Boncha Schweig, on this earth. But there's more to it that's going to come. That we need to be able to do what we can to make our hearts known, our positions open. Sometimes it can be too much on the other side too. After World War II, when the war was over, Nazi soldiers were trying to hide or get out of the country, if it was Germany or other countries. David Ben-Gurion developed a program where he sent Jews to Germany or to Poland to find the murderers of the Jews. And they were tough, rough Israeli, soon-to-be Israeli soldiers. And they made it a point to try to snuff out and find those who killed Jews for no reason. And they killed this relatively small group of Jews from Israel, ended up killing 350 Nazis. They would hunt them down. They would make sure that they knew who it was, that they were doing this appropriately and correctly. They would take this person to a river bed at night. They told him to get on his knees. And at the dark of the night, they pulled out a pistol and put it to his head and said to them, "In the name of the Jewish people, we hereby find you guilty of murder against the Jewish community." Shot him, just like that. And 350 people they found. I don't know why that sticks with me, that story. I don't know if it was the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do. How so? How come?
So that all those people that got murdered can have some sense of justice. They deserve justice.
Right, and we can't lay down. We can't lay down and allow others to. You have to do that which is right. That's what Peretz is trying to say. You have to do that which is right in life, and you have to do that which is dangerous and difficult, but make a statement in your life that you are worthy of living your life too. And when I started this question, what is an optimum person to marry if you lived in Russia in the 1800s, and you would marry a yeshiva bocher? When Israel was created as a state, no longer was it a Yiddish bocher to be married. all of the magazines that were created in Israel and shown in Israel showed Jews who were tough, Jews who were tanned by the sun, Jews who knew how to fight, Jews who knew how to farm. Kibbutzim were important. I mean, Udi, you probably can say more about it than that. I mean, you served in the Israeli army. But the Israeli army is much different today than it was prior to the establishment of the country. Far different. And one of my favorite stories about this whole situation was in 1967, when the Six-Day War occurred. That was one of the trips that I took to Israel as a young guy. And we met with the mayor of Haifa, who spoke to us and said, I got a phone call from a German right after the Six-Day War was over. He wanted to talk to me. I never knew the guy. He didn't know me. I didn't know him. And he said, I'm just calling you because I admire what you, the Israelis, did that you never had done before in medieval or even early century. You fought. In fact, I want you to know that I was a Nazi fighter in World War II many years ago. And I read about what you guys did to destroy 6 Arab armies in 6 days. It was a blitzkrieg, he said. It was a blitzkrieg. And I admire you for the guts and for the fight that you maintained. The mayor of Haifa didn't know how to respond to that. On the one hand, he appreciated the fact that they did something, that he wasn't a schlemazel, you know? He wasn't a Boicha who never did anything. That this was an army that said, no longer are we going to be beat up and kicked about, because we deserve to be able to live as we can and should. Oh. But goes back to the 13, 14, 1500s. This was a catch, because the person who was the yeshiva bocher and who had scholarship and who knew Talmud was the person who was best regarded in the community. Okay, so can we go on further? Okay, let's go to the next page. He goes to, would it be easier if I just told you these things again? Okay, yeah. What time are we supposed to be ending? Oh, 5 or 6. 5 minutes. Okay. So at the end of this story, he goes to be a person who was related to Job. That he was found all of the memories that Boinche Schweig had left in his mind was articulated by the angels in heaven. And they said, you never complained, Boinche. When you were thrown out, when you were beat up, when no one would listen to you, and you never said a word. We admire you. But now you're coming to heaven, and you will be celebrated, and you will be honored, because you never were mean to a soul, even though you had every right to be realized as somewhat significant. So we decided that now that you're here, you can have anything you want every single day now that you are here in heaven. What would you like? And he thinks for a while, and he says to them in a very modest manner, well, if it's not too much trouble, I would like to have a little butter with my bread every morning. And all of the angels in heaven held their heads and cried. This is the only thing that you can respond to? This is what you think is exaltation? How we can't be like that. So we'll finish with that. We have to be strong, and we have to convince others that we have to live our lives the best we possibly can. So, well, yeah, did I have it here? What I did, but you will have them? Oh, this book. Oh, this is a book because my grandmother's name is. No, I was going to ask that did you get these to read? Okay, so these are the three stories. How are you?
Everybody's too afraid to tell you that we're going to move to the next thing, so they don't ask me to do it.
That's fine.
This is the picture.
This was just to take. Some of these were just to take.
So these are names of the people in the town?
Yeah.
I will call you. I want to come show you something. My grandparents owned land. I think it was in Lot, and they gave it to the Jewish United Fund. It was worth a lot of money. So there's a telegram from Israel to my grandparents, my great-grandparents, and they gave the land to Israel. So now, we've never been to Israel. If I ever go, I'll bring this man. It's on the land my family owns.
There's a connection to it.
That's all I'm ever seeing.
We were inspired about 8 years ago.
Oh, you were?
Right.
Maybe be inspired again next year.
Yeah.
What was it like?
It's a medieval town,
Nice.
and for a while it was a seat of Catholicism. The church, the center of town, was a seat of
Was
not
that
Rome, but Dutch by the Greek period. I don't know the history of what brought it there.
Did they have two women on the churches? One blindfolded, that was the Jew.